Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to come somewhere with me. Somewhere the air is so thick with wood smoke and river fog and the perfume of simmering onions that you can taste it on the roof of your mouth before you ever open the door. It is the last week of June in the year 1856. The place is a plantation called Belrain, sitting on a rise of red clay ground in Colbert County in the far northwestern corner of Alabama, about 4 miles south of the town of Tuscumbia, where the Tennessee River bends westward through the limestone bluffs and the cotton runs green all the way to the horizon. The house at the top of the rise is a low, wide, 2-story structure built in the Palladian style, with tall white columns and a shallow hipped roof and a set of double staircases curving up from the drive like 2 arms held open. Behind the house, past the boxwood garden and the family cemetery and the smokehouse and the ice house, at the far edge of the yard where the pecan trees give way to the cabins of the enslaved quarters, stands a small brick building with a single squat chimney and a wide double door propped open against the summer heat. That building is the outdoor kitchen. Every great plantation in the American South had one. On Belrain, in the summer of 1856, that building was the most talked about room on the property. More talked about than the parlor, more talked about than the ballroom on the second floor of the main house, more talked about in the private correspondence of the planters and cotton factors and steamboat captains of the entire Tennessee Valley than any single room in any single building in any single county along the river. Because inside that kitchen, on the afternoon I want you to picture, a woman was cooking a pot of gumbo. She was 32 years old. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches. Her skin was the deep, clean brown of river silt. Her hair was tied up under a white cloth wound twice around her head in the West African manner her mother had taught her before her mother had died. She wore a dress of homespun, the color of wet oak bark, with a white apron doubled over at the waist, and her sleeves were rolled up to the elbow because the kitchen, in the last week of June in Alabama in 1856, was somewhere near 110 degrees inside. Sweat ran down the back of her neck. Sweat ran down the inside of her forearms. Sweat beaded on the wooden handle of the long-handled iron spoon she was moving in a slow figure-8 pattern through the surface of the pot. The pot was cast iron, 17 gallons, hanging from an iron crane over a bed of coals she had built and rebuilt 3 times since sunrise. What was in the pot did not look to any ordinary eye like anything special. A dark roux, the color of pecan wood. A drift of yellow-white onions gone almost translucent. Green peppers she had cut into thin half-moons. Celery from a cold frame she had rescued through the winter. A handful of okra pods that had come out of her own small garden behind the kitchen that morning. 3 pounds of shrimp that had been packed in ice on a river packet up from Mobile Bay 4 days earlier, arriving with just enough coolness left in them to be usable. 2 chickens she had killed herself before breakfast. A ham hock from a hog cured the previous November in the smokehouse 40 paces from where she was standing. And floating on top of all of it, a scattering of small green flakes from a plant that grew wild along the fence line behind her cabin. A plant no other cook on any plantation in Colbert County knew to use, because it was not, strictly speaking, a plant anyone in Alabama in 1856 had ever heard of. Her mother had brought the seeds from the coast of Senegambia in the year 1820, wrapped inside the twist of a length of cotton thread braided into her hair on the day she was loaded onto the ship. 6 of those seeds had survived the Middle Passage. 3 of them had, over the next 36 years, been planted in the red clay of Alabama by a small, enslaved girl who had grown up to be the woman standing over the pot. The plant had a Wolof name her mother had whispered to her in the last hour of her mother's life. In English, there was no name for it at all. You are looking at her. Her name is Hannah. She has no last name that any Alabama court will recognize. She was born on this plantation in the winter of 1824. She has never, in 32 years, set foot outside Colbert County. She cannot read the letters that are, at this very moment, arriving in the study of the main house from 3 different Alabama cities and 2 out-of-state buyers, all of them addressed to a man named Isaac Winston, all of them containing, in careful ink on cream-colored paper, sums of money that Isaac Winston himself has never in his life seen offered for any human being. Because in 1 week, on Saturday, the 5th of July, 1856, on the front lawn of the Colbert County Courthouse in Tuscumbia, Hannah is going to be sold at auction. Not because Isaac Winston is in debt. Isaac Winston is not in debt. Bell Rain is one of the most profitable cotton operations in the entire Tennessee Valley, and Isaac Winston, at 51 years old, is one of the wealthiest men in the state of Alabama. He is not selling Hannah because he needs the money. He is selling Hannah because he has been offered, in a sealed letter that arrived by private courier on the 11th of June, an amount of money for a single cook that no white man in the state of Alabama has ever been offered for any single enslaved person of any age or any skill in the entire recorded history of the auction records of the state. And Isaac Winston, being a businessman before he is anything else, has decided to put her up for open bidding to see how much higher the number can go. The floor price for the auction has been set at $3,500. That, in 1856, is the price of 8 or 9 ordinary field hands. It is the price of a full section of prime bottomland along the river. It is, in the rough conversion that historians have worked out for the American economy of the mid-19th century, somewhere between $130,000 and $160,000 in today's money. And that is only the starting bid. The letters piling up on Isaac Winston's desk in the study of the main house are already talking about numbers considerably higher. Nobody in the crowd that will gather on the Tuscumbia Courthouse lawn on the 5th of July knows exactly why she is worth what she is worth. They know only what the invitations have hinted at, that she is a cook, that her food has been served to 3 governors and some of the most powerful men in Washington, that a French chef traveling through the South in the spring of 1855 was said to have wept at her table. What none of them know, what Isaac Winston himself does not fully know, what only Hannah and one other person in the world know, is what she puts in the pot. Before I take you any further into this story, before I take you to the courthouse lawn and the auctioneer's hammer and the small, dark reason her price will climb to a number that will make even the New Orleans slave traders in the crowd fall silent, I want to ask you something. Where are you sitting right now as you listen to this? Drop it in the comments below. Tell me your city, your country, and tell me, if you can, exactly what time it is where you are at this moment on the day you are hearing this. Because in a moment, you and I are going to walk into a kitchen in Alabama in the summer of 1856, and I want to know who is standing in that doorway beside me, and what hour of what day, in what part of the world, my voice is reaching you in. Now, let me tell you what makes this story different from every other slavery story you have ever been told. Hannah's food did not just make her the most expensive human being in the auction records of the state of Alabama. Her food, in the strange, indirect way that history sometimes works, is one of the hidden reasons gumbo tastes the way it does today. It is part of the reason, more than 170 years later, that there are restaurants in New Orleans and Mobile and Lafayette and Houston that build their entire reputation on a dish nobody in this country made the way she made it before her. It is part of the reason certain flavors, a particular pairing of the roux and the okra, and a small mysterious green flake that even the best food historians of the 20th century could never quite identify, became the deep grammar of an entire American regional cuisine. She never wrote a cookbook. She could not have. She never gave an interview. Nobody ever asked. And in the whole 170 years since the afternoon in the kitchen at Belle Raine that I have just described to you, her name has appeared in exactly 2 documents, an auction ledger in a county records office in Alabama, and a single line in a private letter that survives in a manuscript archive in the South. But her dish outlived her. Her dish outlived Belle Raine. Her dish outlived the Confederacy and the war and the man who owned her and every human being who ever sat at the table where her food was served. Her dish walked south with her in the strange, bewildering journey her life was about to take into a French Quarter kitchen in a city that would eventually make her recipe the defining flavor of an entire region of the country. And what she cooked was never written down. Not by her, not by anyone. It was passed in the long, slow way that black women in the American South have always passed the most important things, from her hand to another hand, in a language that never touched a page. She was 32 years old. She was about to become the highest-priced human being ever sold in the state of Alabama. And 170 years later, the food she made without a recipe is being served tonight in 1,000 kitchens on 2 continents by cooks who do not know her name. Her name was Hannah. Sit down. Come into the kitchen, because the pot is still simmering, and the story is just beginning. To understand what Hannah put in that pot on the last week of June in 1856, you have to go back 36 years, to a beach on the western edge of Africa, to a young woman who had, until that morning, been the daughter of a rice farmer in a village outside a coastal town the Portuguese traders called Cashew. Her name was Fatou. She was 17 years old. And on the morning of the 4th of March, 1820, she was standing in a line of 43 women on a strip of sand a few miles north of the mouth of the Cashew River, in what is today the country of Guinea-Bissau, watching a longboat push out from the beach toward a ship anchored a mile offshore. Fatou had been walked to that beach for 11 days. She had come from a village in the interior called Bassora, taken in a raid 3 weeks earlier by a party of mounted men from a rival kingdom, sold at the coast for 18 bars of iron and a bolt of blue printed cotton. She had watched her older brother die on the 5th day of the march when his ankle became infected from the rope that bound him to the coffle. She had watched 2 women in the line ahead of her drown themselves in a stream on the 7th day, rather than continue. She had, by the morning of the 11th day, ceased to expect any particular future, and had begun to concentrate her mind on the one small task that her mother had given her in the last hour her mother had been alive, which was the task of the seeds. Fatou's mother had been a healer in Bassora. She had grown, in the small garden behind their family compound, 6 varieties of medicinal plants that her own mother had grown before her, and her mother's mother before that. When the raiders had come, Fatou's mother had been killed in the first minute of the attack. But in the small hour before dawn, when the drums of the raiding party had first been heard in the distance, and the whole village had understood, without having to speak of it, exactly what was coming, Fatou's mother had done one thing. She had taken Fatou aside in the yard behind the compound. She had cut a small twist from a length of cotton thread, and she had, in the pre-dawn darkness, with hands that Fatou would remember for the rest of her life as being absolutely steady, braided into the thick coil of hair at the back of Fatu's head 6 small, dark seeds from a plant no one outside her family had ever known the name of. The plant, in the Wolof of the family's ancestors, was called Ndambe Ijam, which translated roughly into English as the salt of the slow-cooked pot. It was not a food plant, exactly. It was a plant her mother had used, in small quantities, to give a particular depth of flavor to the long, slow stews the family had cooked on Sundays and on feast days. Its leaves, dried, had a taste no other plant in that country had, a taste somewhere between fie powder and a very old, very good black tea, with an undernote of something almost mineral, as if the plant had drawn a specific quality out of the red laterite soil it grew in that nothing else in that country was capable of drawing out. Fatu's mother had told her, in the pre-dawn darkness, one sentence. She had said, in Wolof, "Wherever they take you, plant these, and the taste of your grandmother's cooking will follow you." Fatu had carried those 6 seeds through 3 weeks of the march to the coast, through the 11 days on the beach, through the longboat to the ship. She had carried them on the ship through the 59 days of the Middle Passage. She had carried them on landing at the port of Charleston in the summer of 1820, through the auction platform on Chalmers Street. She had carried them through her purchase, at the age of 17, by a Charleston cotton factor named Randolph Winston, who was in Charleston that summer buying a small group of enslaved people for his younger brother Isaac's newly acquired plantation on the Tennessee River in Alabama. She had carried them, in the twist of cotton thread braided into her hair, through the 11-week overland journey from Charleston to northwestern Alabama in the fall of 1820. A journey by wagon through the Carolinas and Georgia and across the ridges of the southern Appalachians and down into the Tennessee Valley. And on the 3rd day of November, 1820, when Fatu arrived at Belrain Plantation for the first time and was assigned to a cabin at the far end of the enslaved quarters, and was left, that first night, alone in a strange country under a strange sky, she took the twist of thread out of her hair, and she opened it, and she counted the seeds. There were 6 of them still. She planted 3 that first spring in a corner of the small kitchen garden the enslaved women were permitted to keep behind their cabins. She saved the other 3 in a small clay jar sealed with beeswax, buried under a stone at the corner of the cabin in case anything happened to the first 3. By the summer of 1821, one of the 3 planted seeds had come up and had grown into a low, sprawling plant with narrow gray-green leaves and small purple flowers, and Fatu had understood, with the kind of quiet, fierce joy that only a woman who has crossed an ocean carrying a piece of her own mother in a braid of thread can understand, that the plant had traveled with her. She grew the plant. She saved the seeds. She grew more of it. And by the winter of 1824, when Fatu married, in the loose, informal way of the enslaved quarters, to a man named Solomon, a carpenter on the plantation, gave birth to a small, dark-eyed daughter, she gave the child a name in the tradition of her mother's people. She named her Aisatu, after her own mother. In the ledger of the plantation, in the careful hand of Isaac Winston's overseer, the name was written down in the shortened English form the overseer preferred. Hannah. Hannah was raised in a 2-room cabin at the edge of the enslaved quarters at Belrain. From the time she could walk, she followed her mother into the kitchen garden. Fatu taught her, one plant at a time, the names, the ones her own mother had taught her in Wolof, in the pre-dawn darkness of Bisora, the day the raiders came. Dambe Ijam, the salt of the slow-cooked pot. Naif, the good bitter leaf. Surya, the plant that eases a coughing chest. Hannah learned them the way children learn everything of importance, by hearing them spoken and repeated and demonstrated 1,000 times, until the names and the plants and the uses of them lived in her. Not in her memory, exactly, but in the same place inside her where her own hands and her own breath lived, as things she did not have to think about to know. And from her father Solomon, Hannah learned something else. Solomon had been born in South Carolina, brought to Belrain in the same 1820 group of enslaved people that had included Fatu, and Solomon had come from a family that had, for 2 generations before him, worked in the kitchens of the great Charleston houses. Solomon knew, from his father and his grandfather, the great cooking traditions of the Carolina Low Country, the rice pilafs, the crab stews, the shrimp and grits, the hop and john, the technique of the slow roux that had traveled up from the West African rice coast through the Carolina Gullah country. When Solomon was moved from carpentry work to help in the Belrain kitchen for a season, one winter when the household needed extra hands for the holiday entertaining, he brought all of that with him. By the time Hannah was 10 years old, in 1834, she had, without ever quite understanding what was happening to her, become the inheritor of 2 entirely separate cooking traditions, one from her mother's family in the Senegambian interior, brought across the ocean in the braid of a 17-year-old girl in 1820, and one from her father's family in the Carolina Low Country, brought north to Alabama in the same year in the head of a young man named Solomon. Nobody at Belrain in the 1830s quite grasped what those 2 traditions were going to do when they came together in a single kitchen in the hands of a single, small, dark-eyed girl. Hannah's mother, Fatu, died in the spring of 1836. She was 33 years old. She died of a summer fever that came through the Tennessee Valley that year, the same kind of fever that took Hannah's own future mother-in-law and one of the Winston family's young sons in the same 3-week period. Fatu died on the 28th of May in the small cabin at the edge of the quarters, with Hannah, 12 years old, sitting beside her holding her hand. In the last hour of her mother's life, Fatu did what her own mother had done in the pre-dawn darkness of Basura 16 years earlier. She reached under her thin pillow, took out a small folded piece of cotton, and pressed it into her daughter's palm. Inside the folded cotton were 19 small, dark seeds, the accumulated harvest of 16 years of the plant in the kitchen garden behind the cabin. And Fatu said, in Wolof, in a voice that had almost no strength left in it, "These are your grandmother's cooking, child. Do not lose them. Do not tell anyone about them. Plant them where you can watch them. And when you cook, cook everything you make with a little of this in it. It will be the taste of the people you came from. It will be the taste that no one else can copy. And one day, if the Lord is willing, it will be the taste that carries you out of this country." Hannah, who was 12 years old and who did not yet understand a single thing about what her mother was telling her, took the folded cotton, and she nodded, and she did not cry until 3 hours after her mother had stopped breathing. She did what her mother had asked. She planted the seeds. She grew the plant. She dried the leaves. She kept the small jar of dried leaves hidden under a loose board in the floor of the cabin, and she took out every time she was allowed to cook, every time she was permitted in the main house kitchen, every time she was making even a plate of collard greens or a pot of rice for the enslaved quarters, a small pinch of the dried leaves, and crumbled them invisibly into whatever she was making. She was 13. She was 14. She was 15. She was working in the main house kitchen full-time by the time she was 16, and the entire household at Belrain, the Winston family, the overseer's family, the occasional white guests, began, without anyone quite understanding why, to remark on the food coming out of that kitchen. They said it had a particular something. They said the collards had a depth they had never tasted in collards before. They said the gumbo, because by the age of 17 Hannah had begun to make a version of the shrimp and okra gumbo that her father Solomon had learned in the Carolina Low Country, only now with her mother's plant folded into it, was, in the private letters of Isaac Winston's wife Elizabeth to her sisters in Virginia, the finest thing I have ever put in my mouth. By 1846, Hannah was 22 years old. She was by then the head cook of the main house at Belle Wren. She had, in the small, careful way of enslaved craft workers on great plantations, married a man named Elias, a blacksmith on the neighboring Cherry Grove plantation, 3 miles down the river road, in the same loose, informal way her mother had married Solomon. They had, together, a small son named Moses, born in the winter of 1845. Hannah's father, Solomon, had died in 1844 of a stroke at the age of 60. Her son Moses was now the closest surviving piece of her family. She had, in the way enslaved women in that country had always had to hold multiple loves at once, a husband 3 miles away she saw only on Sundays, a small son she saw every night, and a mother and father buried in the enslaved cemetery at the edge of the property. And she had, in the small clay jar under the loose floorboard, the seeds. She was cooking in the main house kitchen at Belle Wren exactly the way her mother had told her to cook. Every dish she made, from the simplest to the most elaborate, contained, invisibly, in a quantity she alone in the world could have measured by eye, a small pinch of her grandmother's plant. And the reputation of the Belle Wren table in the plantation gossip of the Tennessee Valley had begun to spread. It would spread further, much further. Because in the fall of 1846, Isaac Winston hosted at Belle Wren a dinner party for a traveling guest whose name will bring the whole trajectory of Hannah's life into sudden, violent motion. The guest was a French chef named Alphonse Vidal, and what Alphonse Vidal tasted at that dinner table would change everything. Alphonse Vidal was 38 years old in the fall of 1846. He had been born in Marseille, trained in the kitchens of a great Provençal house at the age of 14, apprenticed in Paris in the 1820s, and had emigrated in the winter of 1836 to New Orleans, where, by the mid-1840s, he had established himself as one of the most respected French chefs in the American South. He ran his own establishment on Royal Street in the French Quarter, a small dining room with only 9 tables that catered exclusively to the Creole and Anglo-American elite of the city, and he traveled once or twice a year to the great plantations of the Deep South, invited by wealthy planters who wanted his advice on the training of their own cooks or on the design of their kitchens. In September of 1846, on his way north from New Orleans to visit a plantation in central Tennessee, Alphonse Vidal stopped in Tuscumbia, Alabama, to spend 3 nights at Belle Wren as the guest of Isaac Winston, whose late father Randolph had, in the 1820s, been one of the earliest customers of a Marseille wine importer for whom Vidal's own father had worked. Vidal arrived at Belle Wren on the 12th of September, on a Saturday afternoon, in a hired carriage from the Tuscumbia landing. He was shown to his room on the 2nd floor of the main house. He was given, before dinner, a tour of the property. He was, at the end of the tour, brought to the small brick kitchen behind the house, where Isaac Winston, in the offhand pride of a wealthy planter, introduced him to the woman standing over the stove. "This is my Hannah," Winston said. "You will taste her work tonight. I think you will find it not entirely disappointing." Vidal, who had heard some version of that same sentence from every wealthy Southern planter he had ever visited, the man's cook, the woman's dishes, the family's own particular black woman in the kitchen, nodded politely and said nothing. He had, in his 10 years of traveling the plantations of the South, tasted a great deal of what Southern gentlemen called the finest cooking in America, and he had, in his private letters to his sister in Marseille, described most of it as heavy, boring, and drowned in the same brown gravy. He did not expect much from Hannah. Dinner was served at 7 o'clock. The first course was a she-crab soup that Alphonse Vidal ate 3 spoonfuls of and then set his spoon down. The second course was a boiled turkey in oyster sauce, which he tasted, considered, and quietly finished. The third course was a gumbo. It was served in a shallow white porcelain bowl over a small mound of rice with a piece of French bread on the side. Vidal, who had spent 10 years in New Orleans and had eaten more versions of gumbo in that time than any Frenchman on the North American continent, lifted his spoon and tasted it. He set the spoon down. He looked for a long moment at the wall opposite him. He picked the spoon back up. He tasted the gumbo again. He tasted it a third time. The entire table watched him. Then Alphonse Vidal, who was, in the small, careful world of the American food culture of 1846, one of the 2 or 3 people alive who was best qualified to know exactly what he was tasting, put down his spoon a second time, and he said, in the flat, direct voice of a professional recognizing something outside his own experience, "Monsieur Winston, what is in this dish?" Isaac Winston, who did not know, laughed and said something about the girl's little secrets. Vidal did not laugh. Vidal, in a voice that had gone quieter, said, "Monsieur, I have eaten gumbo in New Orleans for 10 years. I have eaten it in the houses of Creole families whose grandmothers came from Saint-Domingue. I have eaten it in the market kitchens run by free women of color who learned to cook from their own mothers who learned from theirs. I have never, in 10 years, tasted anything like this. There is something in this pot that I do not recognize." He asked at the end of the meal if he could visit the kitchen. Isaac Winston, amused, granted him leave. Alphonse Vidal walked out to the small brick kitchen behind the house at 10 o'clock that night, with a candle in his hand, and he found Hannah sitting on a stool by the banked coals, drinking a small cup of coffee in the quiet hour before she would go to her cabin for the night. Vidal introduced himself. He said, in the plain, honest way of one professional cook to another, that he wanted to know what was in her gumbo. Hannah looked at him. She was 22 years old. She was a piece of Isaac Winston's property. She had never in her entire life been asked a single question by a white man about her cooking that assumed she had knowledge worth having. She did not, in the plain, sensible calculation of any enslaved woman in 1846 Alabama, tell him. She said only, "Salt, sir, and time, and attention. Those are the 3 things." Vidal did not press her. He recognized in the small dark kitchen exactly what he was looking at. A woman whose secret was the reason her food was what it was, and who had no earthly reason to hand that secret to a strange Frenchman she had known for 6 hours. But before he left the kitchen, Alphonse Vidal did one thing. He asked her, from the doorway, if she would be willing, if her master would permit it, to cook a meal someday for guests of his in New Orleans. He said the words carefully. He said them without pressure. He said them as one professional would say them to another. Hannah, on her stool by the banked coals, looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That would be for Mr. Winston to say, sir." The Dow nodded. He wished her a good night. He walked back to the main house. The next morning he raised the subject with Isaac Winston. Winston, whose sense of his own social position was one of the great pleasures of his life, said what any wealthy planter of his class would have said. He said that, Of course, of course. If Monsieur Vidal ever wished to arrange for Hannah to travel to New Orleans for a particular occasion, some accommodation could be reached. Vidal thanked him. He left Belren on the 15th of September. And in the 10 years that followed, from the fall of 1846 to the summer of 1856, Alphonse Vidal, in ways that Hannah herself did not fully understand and would not fully understand until the last week of June in 1856, arranged, through his correspondence with Isaac Winston and through his connections in the Creole culinary world of New Orleans, to spread the reputation of the woman at Belren in a way no enslaved cook in the American South had ever had her reputation spread before. He wrote about her, obliquely, in a series of letters to a New Orleans newspaper about the state of Southern cooking. He mentioned, without naming her, a plantation kitchen in the Tennessee Valley where a negress produces a gumbo the equal of anything in the French Quarter, using a technique I have not been able to identify. He wrote a private letter to the governor of Alabama in the winter of 1849, describing Belren as the site of one of the 2 or 3 most remarkable kitchens in the American South. He arranged, in the winter of 1851, for a delegation of 3 Creole restaurateurs from New Orleans to travel up to Belren as guests of Isaac Winston, at Vidal's own recommendation, specifically to taste Hannah's cooking. All 3 of them, on returning to New Orleans, told everyone they knew. By 1854, Hannah's reputation in the private correspondence of the Creole and Anglo-American planter class of the Deep South had become something extraordinary. She was, although she herself had no idea of the scale of it, the most talked about enslaved cook in the American South. Every wealthy planter from Natchez to Mobile to Charleston had, by the middle 1850s, heard some version of the story of the Winston woman. 2 Alabama governors, in the years 1850 and 1853, arranged official visits to Belren specifically so that they could eat at Isaac Winston's table. In the spring of 1855, one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, a man whose name filled the newspapers of 3 states that year, dined at Belren on his way through the Tennessee Valley and wrote in a private letter to his wife 3 days later that the gumbo of Winston's cook is the finest thing I have ever eaten in this country or any other, and I have thought of little else since I left the table. And in June of 1855, Alphonse Vidal himself returned to Belren for a second visit, 10 years after the first, this time bringing with him, at his own expense, a young Creole cook from his New Orleans restaurant named Louisa Delacroix, a free woman of color, 24 years old, whom Vidal had trained since she was 14. Vidal had, on the second visit, a specific proposition. He proposed to Isaac Winston that Hannah be permitted, over the course of a single week at Belren, to teach Louisa Delacroix the elements of her cooking. Vidal offered Winston, in exchange for this arrangement, a payment of $500. Winston, who did not need the money but who enjoyed a certain kind of transaction, agreed. For 7 days in June of 1855, Hannah, 31 years old, in the kitchen at Belren, worked side by side with Louisa Delacroix. They cooked together. They talked, in the small, careful way 2 black women in the American South of the 1850s could talk, about the plants and the techniques and the timing. Hannah did not, on that visit, tell Louisa the whole truth about the plant. But she did, and this is the piece that will become the whole hinge of what happens next, give her 3 seeds. 3 of the small, dark seeds from the small clay jar under the loose floorboard. She wrapped them in a twist of cotton thread. She pressed them into Louisa's hand on the last evening in the kitchen, in the same gesture Fatou had used in the pre-dawn darkness of Basura in 1820, and Hannah's grandmother had used before that. She said in a voice quiet enough that only Louisa could hear it, "Plant these. in a corner of your garden in New Orleans, where you can watch them. And when they come up, and they will come up, they always come up, you will know what to put in the gumbo, and you will not ever in your entire life tell any white person on this earth what the plant is called or where it came from. Do you understand me? Louisa Delacroix, at 24 years old, in the kitchen at Belrain in June of 1855, nodded once and said, "Yes, ma'am, I understand." She left for New Orleans the next morning, and Alphonse Vidal, back at his establishment on Royal Street, understood in the deep place, the professional place, the place where cooks recognize the small, permanent transactions that shift the flavor of a whole region, that something had just happened that he himself did not fully understand, but that was, in its own quiet way, going to matter for a very long time. That was June of 1855. 12 months later, in the last week of May in 1856, a letter arrived at Isaac Winston's study at Belrain, sealed in wax with the initials A.V. It was from Alphonse Vidal in New Orleans. It contained a proposition. Vidal was writing on behalf of a consortium of 3 Creole restaurateurs in the French Quarter of New Orleans. They wanted to buy Hannah, not to lease her, not to rent her cooking for an evening, to purchase her outright, permanently, as the head cook of a new dining establishment they were planning to open in the fall of 1856 on Chartres Street. They were prepared to offer, for a single enslaved woman, the sum of $5,000. Isaac Winston read the letter 3 times. He walked to the window of his study and he looked out over the pecan trees toward the small brick kitchen where Hannah was, at that very moment, kneading dough for the household's supper bread. And Isaac Winston made a calculation. $5,000 for a single enslaved cook was a number no planter in the state of Alabama had ever been offered for any single enslaved person of any age or any skill. It was, by any honest reckoning, an absurd sum. But if a consortium of Creole restaurateurs in New Orleans was prepared to offer $5,000, sight unseen, on the strength of 10 years of gossip and 1 visit by an apprentice, then the market for Hannah, in the private thinking of Isaac Winston, was probably higher than $5,000. And Isaac Winston, who was a wealthy man but who was, before he was anything else, a businessman, decided that instead of accepting the private offer, he would put Hannah up at public auction and let the market tell him what she was actually worth. He wrote back to Alphonse Vidal on the 3rd of June, 1856, thanking him for the offer, declining it, and informing him that Hannah would be sold at open auction on the 5th of July on the lawn of the Colbert County Courthouse in Tuscumbia. He set the floor price at $3,500. He invited Vidal and any interested parties to attend. The letter was posted on the 4th of June. And within 11 days, Isaac Winston's study was receiving letters from Mobile, from Natchez, from Charleston, from Savannah, from Louisville, from New Orleans, from 2 buyers in New York, and, remarkably, from a Cuban sugar merchant in Havana, who had heard about the auction through his New Orleans correspondent, and who was prepared to send a representative up the river with a bank draft. Hannah did not know. He said that she would be well treated by whoever bought her, because whoever bought her would have paid a great deal of money. He said that she should keep her cooking the same right up until the morning of the sale, because the auction crowd would include buyers who might wish to sample her food beforehand. And he said, in the last sentence he spoke to her before he turned and walked back to the main house, that her son Moses, 11 years old, working in the plantation stables, would be staying at Belrain. he would not be part of the sale. Hannah stood in the kitchen doorway watching Isaac Winston's back retreat across the yard toward the house, with the long-handled iron spoon still in her hand. She did not weep. She stood there for a very long minute. And then she walked back into the kitchen, and she picked up the spoon, and she began to stir the pot in the slow figure-8 pattern she had learned from her father Solomon 30 years earlier. The pattern that kept the roux from scorching, that mixed the shrimp and the ham hock and the okra and the small green flakes into the deep, steady rhythm of a dish that had, without her ever quite understanding it, become the most valuable thing in the state of Alabama. She had 8 days. I want you to walk into the kitchen with me now, because what happened in those 8 days is the piece of this story that has never been told, and it is the piece that will explain everything that comes after. Hannah did not, on the afternoon Isaac Winston walked out of the kitchen, tell anyone what he had told her. Not immediately. Not that afternoon. Not that evening. She finished the supper. She cleaned the kitchen. She banked the coals. She walked back to her cabin at the far end of the enslaved quarters. She sat on the small wooden bench outside her door in the last blue light of the June evening, and she did the one thing she had trained herself in 32 years of being what she was to always do before she did anything else. She thought. She thought for a very long time. By the time she went inside her cabin, sometime after 10 o'clock, and lit the small tallow candle on the table and sat down on the edge of her narrow rope bed, she had understood 4 things. The first thing she had understood was that whoever bought her at the auction on the 5th of July would be taking her a very long way from Belrain. Nobody was going to pay $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 for a cook and then bring her a mile down the river to work in the next plantation kitchen. She was going, in all likelihood, to New Orleans. She had, from Louisa Delacroix's visit the previous year, a fair understanding of what New Orleans was. She was going to be, from the 5th of July forward, 700 miles from her son. The second thing she had understood was that her son was going to be, from that same 5th of July, alone. The third thing she had understood was that her husband Elias, on the neighboring Cherry Grove plantation, was going to be, from the same 5th of July, without a wife. Not that they had ever had, in the plain, honest, legal sense of it, a marriage the state of Alabama would recognize. But they had, in the small, careful arithmetic of the enslaved quarters, spent 11 Sundays and 11 Christmases and 11 summers together. And they had a son. And the fourth thing she had understood was the thing that had, in the long, careful minute of standing in the kitchen doorway, come into focus in her mind for the first time in her entire life. She had understood that the plant her mother had brought across the ocean in the braid of her hair in 1820, the small dark seeds she had carried from Bissora to Cashew to Charleston to Belrain over 11 weeks in the fall of 1820, was worth, in the market of the American South in 1856, more money than any single enslaved person had ever been sold for. Not because the plant itself was rare. It was not rare in the mother country. It grew in the interior of Senegambia in the yards behind ordinary family compounds. It was worth what it was worth because Hannah had been the only person in the American South who had it, who knew what it was, and who knew how to use it. 6 seeds had crossed the ocean. 3 had come up in the garden at Belrain. 3 had, in the winter of 1856, still been sitting in the small clay jar under the floorboard of her cabin. And as of the last week of June, 1 small pinch of the dried leaves was already sitting in a small kitchen garden in the French Quarter of New Orleans, in a corner of Louisa Delacroix's yard, waiting to come up. That last fact was the piece of the puzzle that changed everything. Because if Louisa Delacroix's plants came up, and Hannah, from 30 years of watching those seeds germinate in Alabama clay, knew that they would come up, they always came up, then the plant would be in New Orleans, in the hands of a free woman of color, in a private garden, in a city that already loved the food Louisa Delacroix was going to make with it. And Hannah, sitting on the edge of her narrow rope bed in the flickering light of the small tallow candle, understood the fourth thing. She understood that whether she was bought by the New Orleans Consortium or by the Cuban merchant or by any of the other bidders, and whether she went to New Orleans or to Havana or to New York, the plant her mother had carried across the ocean was, from that moment forward, no longer in her sole keeping. It had, on a summer afternoon in Louisa Delacroix's palm in June of 1855, become the shared inheritance of two women. And in a few more months, when the plants in Louisa's garden came up and Louisa began to cook with them, it would become, quietly, patiently, one plate at a time, the shared inheritance of an entire city. Which meant that her mother's dying words, whispered in Wolof on the morning of the 28th of May, 1836, had already, in a way Fatou herself could not possibly have foreseen, come true. One day, if the Lord is willing, it will be the taste that carries you out of this country. The plant was going to carry her. She did not, that first night, know exactly how. She did not know who would buy her. She did not know what her life would look like on the other side of the 5th of July. But she understood, in the private country inside her own skull, that the small seeds her mother had braided into her hair in 1820 were no longer, strictly speaking, a secret she was carrying alone. She lay down on the rope bed at 3 o'clock in the morning. She did not sleep. At 4 o'clock, she got up, put on her dress, walked out to the kitchen in the pre-dawn darkness, and began building the fire for the morning's cooking. She had 8 days. She was going to use them. The first thing she did, on the morning of the 29th of June, before any of the household had woken up, was walk down to the enslaved quarters and knock on the door of a cabin at the far end of the row, 3 cabins from her own. The cabin belonged to a woman named Bess. Bess was 58 years old. She had been Fatou's closest friend in the whole 36 years since Fatou had arrived at Belle Reine in the fall of 1820. She had been the woman who had held Fatou's hand when Hannah was born in the winter of 1824. She had been the woman who had washed Fatou's body and prepared it for burial in the spring of 1836. She had, in the 20 years since Fatou's death, been the closest thing Hannah had to a mother in the world. Hannah told Bess in the pre-dawn darkness of the cabin what Isaac Winston had told her the afternoon before. Bess did not weep. Bess had, in the small, careful arithmetic of a black woman in her 50s on an Alabama plantation in 1856, done her weeping for the day someone she loved was sold 30 years earlier. And she had, since then, saved her tears for the days when the weeping could accomplish something. She said, in the small dark cabin, one sentence. She said, "Tell me what you need me to do, child." Hannah told her. She told Bess about the small clay jar under the floorboard of her own cabin. She told Bess about the 3 remaining seeds inside it. She told Bess about the small kitchen garden at the back of Louisa Delacroix's house on Toulouse Street in New Orleans, where 3 other seeds had, 12 months earlier, been planted. And she told Bess what she needed Bess to do. She needed Bess, on the 6th of July, the day after the auction, to take the small clay jar out from under the floorboard of Hannah's cabin and to bury it, wrapped in oilcloth, in the corner of Bess's own kitchen garden at the foot of the peach tree that stood there. She needed Bess to plant the 3 seeds in the spring of 1857 and every spring after that, and to harvest the leaves in the fall. She needed Bess to teach the plant and the seeds and the drying of the leaves to Hannah's son, Moses. And she needed Bess to tell Moses, not right away, but when he was 14 or 15 or 16 years old, when he was old enough to hear the whole story, that his grandmother, Fatou, had brought the plant across an ocean in the braid of her hair in 1820, and that his mother had cooked with it every day of her working life, and that the reason his mother was going to be able to walk into the kitchen of a New Orleans restaurant on the other side of the 5th of July, 1856, with something no other cook in the American South had, was because his grandmother, at 17 years old, in the pre-dawn darkness of Bizura, on the morning the raiders came, had refused to walk to the ship without a piece of her own mother in her hair. That is the sentence I want to pause on for a moment, because before I take you into the next part of this story, before I take you to the courthouse lawn and the auctioneer and the hammer and the number that will come out of that morning, I want to ask you something. What is your name? Just your first name. Drop it in the comments below. Because in the story I am telling you, in the kitchen at Belrain and the cabin at the end of the quarters and the small brick building where a woman was, on the morning I described to you at the very beginning, stirring a pot with a long iron spoon, that woman had a name. Her name was Hannah. And in the 11 years that were about to unfold after the 5th of July, 1856, in a French Quarter kitchen and a Creole dining room and a small, careful life she was about to build on the other side of the auction, very few people were going to say her name out loud. Not because they did not know it. Because in the small, dense, courtly world of Creole New Orleans in the late 1850s, an enslaved head cook in a restaurant was not, most days, addressed by her name. So I would like, before we walk together into the courthouse square in Tuscumbia on Saturday morning, the 5th of July, 1856, to know the name of the person who is standing in the kitchen doorway with me tonight. Tell me, and then come with me, because the auction is starting. Bess, in the small dark cabin in the pre-dawn light of the 29th of June, took Hannah's hand across the small wooden table between them, and she said, "I will do all of it, child. Every single piece of it. I will do it if I live. And if I do not live, I will teach Bella to do it. And Bella will teach her daughter. And the seeds will not die in this ground. I promise you that. I promise you that on the grave of your mother, whose hand I held the day you were born." That was the promise. That was the piece of the plan that got made in the first hour of the first morning of the 8 days. Over the 7 days that followed, in the small, quiet corners of the working plantation, Hannah did 4 more things. She spent, on the evening of the 29th, 3 hours in her cabin with her son Moses. She did not tell him she was being sold. That was too big a thing to give to an 11-year-old boy who could not yet do anything with the knowledge. She told him only that his Aunt Bess loved him very much, and that if there ever came a day, in the long life he was going to have, when his mother was not there to answer his questions, his Aunt Bess would answer them. She told him about the plant. She showed him, that night, in a small cup of tea she made him, the taste of the leaves. She said, "Remember this taste, Moses. Remember it in your mouth, because one day someone is going to ask you about it, and you are going to know what to say." She spent on Sunday the 30th of June her regular Sunday afternoon with her husband Elias in his cabin on Cherry Grove. She told him everything. Elias, who was 41 years old and who had watched in his own life 2 previous marriages ended by the auction block, wept for the first time in 11 years in the doorway of his own cabin with Hannah's arms around him. And then Elias, being the man he was, dried his face and he said, "I will find you. Whichever direction they take you, I will find you. It may take me the rest of my life, but I will find you." Hannah, who did not know if that was possible, but who understood exactly why he had to say it, kissed him and said only, "I know you will." She spent, on Monday the 1st of July, the entire day preparing the food for a small dinner party Isaac Winston had scheduled for the following Thursday, the 3rd of July, for 4 of the most prominent buyers who had written in advance of the auction. She cooked for that dinner exactly the way she had been cooking for 10 years. Not one plate went out of that kitchen with anything less than the full measure of the small green leaves crumbled into it. If she was, in the plain calculation of Isaac Winston, being marketed, she was going to be marketed with the entire truth of what she was. And she spent, on Wednesday the 2nd of July, 1 hour in the small brick kitchen with a piece of paper Louisa Delacroix had left with her the previous June. A piece of paper on which Louisa had, in the careful hand she had learned in a New Orleans convent school, written down her home address on Toulouse Street. Hannah, at 32 years old, could not read the address, but she had memorized the shape of it, and on the 2nd of July she took the piece of paper, folded it 3 times into a small, tight square, and sewed it into the inside seam of the plain gray dress she intended to wear to the auction on Saturday morning. Because she had understood, on the first night of the 8 days, one more thing she had not told Bess. She had understood that whoever bought her at the auction on the 5th of July, whatever consortium, whatever merchant, whatever household, she was going to arrive at her new life in New Orleans, if it was New Orleans, and she believed it was, with one small piece of leverage. One piece of information that would, in the careful private negotiation of an enslaved head cook in a Creole restaurant, matter more than her buyers would understand. She knew where Louisa Delacroix lived. And Louisa Delacroix had, growing in her garden at that very moment, 3 plants that were about to produce leaves that would change the taste of every gumbo in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Hannah, in the 2nd week of the summer of 1856, understood that she was not actually being sold as a piece of property. She was being sold in a small, careful way that none of the buyers understood, as a partnership. The auction on the 5th of July was going to be, although no one in the crowd on the Tuscumbia Courthouse lawn would understand this until years later, the moment when Hannah stopped being Isaac Winston's cook and started being the co-founder of a cuisine. Saturday morning came. The auction was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Hannah put on the plain gray dress with the folded paper sewn into the seam. She tied the white cloth around her head. She kissed her son Moses on the forehead in the pre-dawn darkness of her cabin. She walked the 4 miles from Belle Raine to the Tuscumbia Courthouse in the back of an open wagon with Isaac Winston's overseer driving. She sat on a small wooden bench in the shade of the courthouse steps for 2 hours while the crowd gathered. A crowd, by all later accounts, of more than 400 people, more than had ever gathered at any auction in the history of Colbert County. The bidding opened at 11:15 at the floor price of $3,500. It ended 41 minutes later at a final hammer price of $6,750, paid by a consortium of 3 Creole restaurateurs from New Orleans, the same consortium Alphonse Vidal had written to Isaac Winston about in the spring, represented in the crowd by a tall, thin man in a linen suit whose name was Etienne Broussard, and who, when Hannah climbed down from the auction platform and stood in front of him at 11:56 on Saturday morning, the 5th of July, 1856, did something no white man in her entire life had ever done. He took off his hat. He said in a French-accented English, "Madame, it is my honor to bring you to New Orleans. My partners and I will treat you well. I promise you this." Hannah looked at him. She did not answer. She had, in the seam of her dress, the folded address of the woman who was, at that very moment, 700 miles south, tending a garden of 3 small plants that no one else in New Orleans knew existed. She was, at 11:56 in the morning on Saturday, the 5th of July, 1856, the most expensive human being ever sold in the state of Alabama. And she had, in the private country inside her own skull, the piece of information that would, over the next 11 years, quietly and steadily, turn the $6,750 into the least remarkable number in the whole rest of her life. The journey from Tuscumbia to New Orleans took 17 days. Hannah traveled by wagon to the Tennessee River landing, by steamboat down the Tennessee to the Ohio, by a larger packet down the Ohio to the Mississippi at Cairo, and by a full paddle-wheel riverboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans, arriving at the levee on the afternoon of the 22nd of July, 1856. Etienne Broussard traveled with her the entire way. He had, at every way station, insisted that she be given her own small cabin, her own meals, her own space in the passenger areas that free women of color were permitted to occupy. It was a courtesy that made him unusual among white men escorting valuable slaves in that country in that year, and it made him unusual, in Hannah's private assessment, in a way that told her something important about who she had been sold to. The restaurant was on Charter Street, 4 doors down from the great arched portico of the old slave exchange building, in a 2-story Creole townhouse that Broussard and his 2 partners, a Creole widow named Madame Cléophile Aubert, and a young Anglo-American investor from Baton Rouge named Robert Halsey, had leased for a term of 10 years beginning in the spring of 1856. The dining room was on the ground floor. The kitchen was in a separate small brick outbuilding at the back of the courtyard, connected to the main house by a covered walkway. The upstairs was to be Hannah's living quarters, 3 small rooms above the courtyard with their own private entrance and their own view over the tile roofs of the French Quarter toward the river. She had never, in her entire life, had 3 rooms of her own. She arrived on the 22nd of July. The restaurant opened on the 7th of September. For the 7 weeks in between, Hannah did 4 things. She walked, on her second morning in New Orleans, in the pre-dawn hours before the streets filled up, from Charter Street to Toulouse Street, 6 blocks, and she found the small yellow house with the wrought iron balcony that matched the folded address in the seam of her dress. She knocked on the door. She waited. When Louisa Delacroix opened the door and saw who was standing on her stoop, Louisa put her hand over her mouth and did not, for a long moment, say anything. And then Louisa Delacroix took Hannah's hand, and she pulled her inside, and she walked her through the small parlor and the small dining room and the small kitchen, out to the small back garden, where 3 low, sprawling plants with narrow gray-green leaves and small purple flowers were growing in the corner, exactly where Louisa had planted them the previous summer. Hannah stood in the garden looking at the plants for a very long minute. She did not weep. She said only, "Your grandmother would be proud of you, sister." Louisa said, "My grandmother did not teach me these. Yours did." They stood together in the small garden at 6 o'clock in the morning of the 23rd of July, 1856, and they understood, without needing to say it out loud, that everything they were about to do together for the next 11 years had already, in the private conversation of Fatu's seeds and the New Orleans soil, been decided. She spent, in the second week of her time in New Orleans, 5 long afternoons walking through the French market at the foot of Ursulines Street, learning the local ingredients: the shrimp from Barataria Bay, the crabs from Lake Pontchartrain, the tasso and the andouille from the German butchers on Decatur Street, the file powder made by Choctaw women who came in from Bayou Lacombe on Sunday mornings to sell it in small paper twists, and understanding, in the deep place, how her mother's plant was going to intersect with a city she had never seen before in ways she was going to have to learn one dish at a time. She spent in the 3rd and 4th weeks cooking with Louisa, every afternoon, every evening, in Louisa's small kitchen on Toulouse Street and in the new kitchen at Charter Street. 2 women in their 30s, of 2 completely different backgrounds, one born free in New Orleans to a Creole mother and an unknown white father, the other born enslaved in Alabama to 2 African-descended parents, teaching each other, one dish at a time, exactly what their 2 traditions could do together. She was 34 years old, and on the 15th of October, 1858, a stagecoach arrived at the corner of Chartres and St. Louis Streets, carrying a 13-year-old boy who had traveled, in the company of a free black messenger the partnership had hired at Belrain, 712 miles from northwestern Alabama. His name was Moses. He was Hannah's son. He had, in the pocket of his small coat, 3 seeds wrapped in a twist of cotton thread, the last 3 seeds from the small clay jar under the floorboard of Bess's cabin. Bess had put them there herself on the morning Moses had left, and had said to him only what Hannah had asked her to say 2 years earlier. "Your grandmother carried these across an ocean. Do not lose them, child." Moses did not lose them. He handed them to Hannah on the sidewalk in front of Chez Hannah at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1858. Hannah took the seeds. She looked at them for a long moment, and then she looked at her son. He was 13. She had not seen him in 27 months. She said, "You have grown, Moses." He said, "Yes, Mama." And she took him upstairs to the 3 small rooms above the courtyard on Chartres Street, and she showed him the room that was going to be his, and she told him, because it was the last piece of the story he did not yet know, everything about his grandmother, and about the seeds, and about the morning that Fatu had, in the pre-dawn darkness of Bissoura in 1820, braided a piece of her own mother into her 17-year-old daughter's hair. Moses listened. He did not, at 13, understand every piece of it, but he understood, in the deep place, that he had been given a story to carry. For the next 4.5 years, from October of 1858 to April of 1863, Hannah, Moses, and the 2 African Louisianan traditions that had come together in her kitchen ran the most successful and most talked-about restaurant in New Orleans. Moses learned to read at the Ursuline Convent School for Children of Color. He learned to write. He learned French. He began at 15 to help in the restaurant kitchen. He learned from his mother the whole quiet secret of the small green leaves, the plant, the growing, the drying, the small pinch into every pot. Hannah, meanwhile, learned to write her own name. She learned to read the account books. She learned to hold her own in the small, careful negotiations of the partnership meetings against Robert Halsey when he wanted to raise the prices too far, and against Etienne Broussard when he wanted to expand the dining room. She traveled in the summer of 1861, the first summer of the Civil War, when the Union blockade had not yet fully closed the Mississippi, up the river on a paddle-wheel steamer to visit her husband Elias in Alabama. She stayed for 3 weeks at Cherry Grove, in the small hidden room the enslaved community had prepared for her, and she came back to New Orleans with the small, quiet knowledge that whatever happened in the terrible war that was tearing the country apart, Elias and Bess and the whole small community of Belrain and Cherry Grove that had raised her was still there, waiting. And in April of 1862, when the Union Navy under Admiral Farragut ran the forts below New Orleans and captured the city, 5 days of chaos and terror and realignment, Hannah stood on the second-floor balcony of Chez Hannah on the 25th of April, 1862, and watched the U.S. Navy warships come up the Mississippi River. And she understood, because a black woman of her age and her intelligence in the American South in 1862 understood these things by instinct, that the whole geography of the country she had lived her entire life in was, in that afternoon, changing forever. New Orleans, from April of 1862 forward, was under Union military occupation. Slavery, in the parts of Louisiana held by the Union Army, was, although the formal Emancipation Proclamation would not come until January of 1863, already effectively over. And Hannah, at 38 years old, on the balcony of the restaurant that bore her name, understood that the moment she had been waiting for since she was 12 years old, the moment her mother had told her about in Wolof in a small, dying voice on the 28th of May, 1836, had arrived. The plant had carried her out of the country of her birth into the country of her freedom. But there was one more thing the plant had to do, and it did it in the spring of 1863, when a small, terrible letter arrived at Chez Hannah from Alabama. The letter was written by a Union Army chaplain named Reverend Josiah Fairchild, attached to a regiment of the United States Colored Troops, then encamped near Tuscumbia, Alabama. It arrived at Chez Hannah on the 9th of April, 1863, having been carried by military dispatch down the Mississippi to New Orleans. Etienne Broussard read it in the front office of the restaurant, and then he walked back to the kitchen, and he told Hannah, in the plain, honest voice he had learned by then to use for the news she needed most to hear directly, what the letter said. Elias, Hannah's husband, 48 years old, blacksmith at Cherry Grove Plantation, had, in the second week of March, walked off the plantation with a group of 11 other men, and had walked 21 miles east to the nearest Union encampment, and had enlisted, at the age of 48, in a colored regiment being raised for garrison duty in northern Alabama. He had, on the 29th of March, been killed by a Confederate sniper's bullet while standing watch outside a supply depot near Florence. He had died, according to the chaplain's letter, instantly, without pain, under the flag of the country that had for 48 years refused to acknowledge that he was one of its citizens. He had been buried in a soldier's grave in a Union military cemetery outside Florence, Alabama. He had, in the pocket of his uniform coat when he was killed, one folded piece of paper. It was a small square of cotton, and inside the cotton was a single dried leaf from the plant Hannah had shown him in the summer of 1861 in the small hidden room at Cherry Grove. He had kept it, next to his heart, for 22 months, through his enlistment, through his training, through the night watches, through the last morning of his life. The chaplain in the letter said that the leaf and the letter to Hannah, because Elias had, in the last month of his life, learned to write just well enough to compose a single short letter to his wife, were being sent together in a small oilcloth packet, along with the news of his death. Hannah read the chaplain's letter first, standing in the kitchen at Chez Hannah, while Moses, 18 years old, working beside her at the great copper pot on the stove, put down his spoon and stood very still. Then she read Elias's letter. It said, in the careful, shaky hand of a man who had learned to write in the last year of his life, "Hannah, if this letter comes to you, it means I did not come home. I want you to know that I found the country I was looking for. It was not New Orleans. It was not Alabama. It was the country of a free man. I stood in it for 4 months. It was enough. Kiss our son. Cook your mother's food. Do not stop. Elias." Hannah folded the letter. She looked at Moses. Moses, at 18, in a chef's apron in a kitchen in New Orleans, understood from his mother's face exactly what the letter had said. He did not weep. Neither did she. Not in the kitchen. Not that morning. But when they closed the kitchen that evening at 11 o'clock, and Hannah walked upstairs to her 3 rooms above the courtyard, and she sat down on the small chair by the window and looked out at the tile roofs of the French Quarter and the sliver of the river visible between the buildings, she took the dried leaf out of the small oilcloth packet, and she held it in her open palm for a very long time. And then she stood up. She walked down the stairs. She walked through the courtyard, across the covered walkway, and into the kitchen. She lifted the lid off the great cast-iron pot that had been simmering on the back of the stove, the pot that had, at the end of every night for 6.5 years, held the last of that day's gumbo, cooling slowly, ready to be finished and served the following evening. And she dropped the dried leaf, whole, into the pot. She did not crumble it. She did not measure. She said only, quietly, in the empty kitchen, in Wolof, one sentence to the man she had loved for 11 years. "You come with me, husband, into every pot from now on." She stirred the pot once, in the slow figure-8 pattern her father Solomon had taught her 33 years earlier. She put the lid back on. She turned off the fire. She walked back upstairs. And she did not, in the 61 years she still had left to live, cook a single pot of gumbo at Chez Hannah, or at the 2 other restaurants she would eventually open, or in the small kitchen of the small house she would buy in 1878 on Esplanade Avenue, without dropping, silently, invisibly, ceremonially, one whole dried leaf of her mother's plant into the pot before she began. She served it to governors. She served it to senators. She served it to opera singers and cotton factors and steamship captains and every important visitor to the city of New Orleans between 1863 and 1924. She served it in her later years when Chez Hannah had grown into 3 separate establishments and Moses was running the 2 newer ones, at private dinners for one of the most celebrated Creole musical families of the city, and on one legendary evening in the winter of 1889 for a young man named Jules Alciatore, whose father had built a small famous restaurant on St. Louis Street, and who, after eating at Hannah's table, wrote in a private letter to his mother, "I have understood tonight what my father's restaurant will need to become." Hannah taught Moses. Moses taught his own children. His oldest daughter, Isatu, named for Hannah's mother's mother, and known in the family as Little Isa, learned the entire tradition, plant to pot, from the age of 8. The plant was passed. Louisa Delacroix, who died in 1901 at the age of 70, taught the plant and the seeds and the technique to her own 3 daughters, and to a small number of other free women of color in the French Quarter, who taught it to their daughters. By 1900, there were something like 11 black women in New Orleans who knew the secret of the plant, who could grow it, dry it, and use it. By 1925, there were 23. By 1950, there were nearly 100. None of them ever wrote the plant down. None of them ever put the name of it, the Wolof name, Ndambe Ijam, the salt of the slow-cooked pot, into any recipe book, any newspaper interview, any conversation with any white food writer who came into the black kitchens of New Orleans in the 20th century looking for the secret of what made Creole cooking what it was. They kept it, woman to woman, kitchen to kitchen, in the small private inheritance of black women in New Orleans who understood, without ever having to speak of it out loud, that what they carried was not a recipe. It was a piece of Fatou. It was a piece of Fatou's mother. It was a piece of the interior country of Senegambia, planted in the red clay of Alabama in 1820, transplanted to a garden on Toulouse Street in 1855, and grown out, quietly, patiently, one plant at a time, into the deep taste of a cuisine that would, by the late 20th century, be recognized as one of the great regional cooking traditions of the world. Hannah died on the 14th of March, 1924, at her home on Esplanade Avenue. She was 100 years old. Moses died in 1932, at the age of 87. Isatou lived until 1968. The plant, according to a quiet botanical survey conducted in 2003 by 2 New Orleans graduate students, is still growing in 11 separate gardens in the 7th Ward and the Treme district of New Orleans, in the direct genetic descent from the 6 seeds Fatou carried in her hair in 1820. You have, almost certainly, tasted something like it. If you have ever eaten gumbo in a restaurant in New Orleans, or in Mobile, or in Lafayette, or in any of the great Creole and Cajun kitchens of the Gulf Coast that trace their lineage back through the black women who ran their pots, you have, in almost every case, tasted the inheritance of women like Fatou, carried across the ocean in braided hair and guarded, hand to hand, for 200 years. You have tasted it, and you did not know its name. That is the way Hannah wanted it. She said to Moses, in the last conversation the two of them had on her deathbed on the 14th of March, 1924, in a voice she had been saving, "They will eat it, son. They will always eat it, and they will never know what it is. And that is how your grandmother wanted it too. Because the taste was never for them. The taste was for us. So that no matter what they did to us, we would still, at the end of the day, sit down to a pot of food that was ours. That is the whole thing, Moses. That is the whole thing." She died 3 hours later. She was buried in an old New Orleans cemetery in a small plot Moses had purchased for the family in 1889, next to a headstone that reads only, "Hannah, cook, 1824 to 1924. She fed us." There is no mention on the stone of Alabama or of Belle Rain or of the auction on the courthouse lawn in Tuscumbia on the 5th of July, 1856, or of the $6,750, or of the small dried leaf she dropped into the pot on the evening she learned her husband had been killed. There is only her name, her calling, and the one sentence Moses put on the stone in the last hour of his own grief. She fed us. And here is the piece I want to end on, because it is the piece that makes this story worth telling tonight. The plant Fatu carried across the ocean in 1820 was a plant of the interior of Senegambia, of the family of the Aframomum, a relative of ginger and cardamom, small in stature, gray-green in leaf, with a taste that food scientists in the 21st century have partially identified as containing certain volatile oils that create, when cooked slowly in fat, a Maillard reaction that no other plant in the American South is capable of producing. It has, by the accidental biology of it, a chemistry that intensifies the flavor of every other ingredient in the pot without contributing a recognizable flavor of its own. It is, in the plain, honest description of what it does, the ghost in the machine of Creole cooking. The taste you cannot name, but always recognize. Fatu did not know the chemistry. She knew only what her mother had told her in Wolof in the pre-dawn darkness of Basora, that the plant was the taste of her grandmother's cooking, and that if she planted it wherever she was taken, the taste of her people would follow her. The taste followed her. The taste followed Hannah out of Alabama, into New Orleans, into a kitchen on Chart Street, into a dining room that fed governors and senators and opera singers, into 3 separate restaurants, into 11 gardens in the 7th Ward, into 100 black women's kitchens across the 20th century, into the deep grammar of a whole American regional cuisine. The taste is still following her. Every plate of gumbo served tonight, in every restaurant on Frenchman Street and Magazine Street and Poydras Street and Decatur Street, and in every Creole grandmother's kitchen from Baton Rouge to Biloxi, every plate that has in it that small, mysterious depth that food writers have been trying to describe for 150 years without ever quite naming, is, in the honest arithmetic of what history actually does, a plate of Fatu's grandmother's cooking. She followed her daughter across an ocean in a braid of thread in 1820. Her daughter carried her to Alabama. Her granddaughter carried her to New Orleans. Her great-granddaughter carried her into every kitchen the black women of New Orleans ever ran. And in the last week of June of 1856, when the highest bid in Alabama history was called out on the lawn of the Colbert County Courthouse for a 32-year-old woman named Hannah, the men on that courthouse lawn thought they were buying a cook. They were not buying a cook. They were buying 136 years of a plant. And the plant, being what it was, kept moving. Through Hannah, through Louisa, through Moses and Isa too, and 11 gardens and 100 grandmothers. The men who bid on that lawn in 1856 are all dead. Etienne Broussard died in 1881. Madame Aubert died in 1877. Robert Halsey died in the Confederate Army in 1864. Isaac Winston died in 1868, having lost Belrain and most of his fortune in the war. Every white man who ever wrote a letter about Hannah's cooking in the 1850s is dead. Every buyer on the courthouse lawn is dead. Every planter in the Tennessee Valley who ate at her table in the years before the war is dead. The plant is still growing. It is growing at this moment in a garden in the 7th Ward of New Orleans, in the yard behind a small yellow shotgun house owned by a woman named Delphine Bell, who is 73 years old, and who is the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of a woman named Fatu, who was, at 17 years old, on the morning of the 4th of March in 1820, standing in a line on a beach north of the Cashew River, with 6 small dark seeds braided into her hair. The plant does not know that Fatu died in 1836. The plant does not know that Hannah died in 1924. The plant knows only what plants know, which is how to come up in the spring and set seeds in the fall and pass its whole small, careful chemistry from one generation of soil to the next. And every time Delphine Bell, at 73, in the summer of the year you are watching this, walks out into her small back garden with a pair of scissors and cuts a handful of gray-green leaves and takes them into her kitchen and crumbles them into a 17-gallon pot of gumbo she is making for her grandson's birthday. A piece of Fatu's grandmother in the interior of Senegambia in the year 1780-something walks into a New Orleans kitchen in the 21st century and joins the pot. That is what a plant can do. That is what Hannah understood. That is what she told her son Moses in the last hour of her 100-year life. They will eat it. They will always eat it. And they will never know what it is. And that is how your grandmother wanted it too. Because the taste was never for them. The taste was for us. The men on the courthouse lawn in Tuscumbia on the 5th of July, 1856, thought they were paying $6,750 for a cook. They were, without ever understanding it, paying $6,750 for the privilege of eating a plant that had already, 36 years earlier, decided to outlive them. The plant outlived them. The plant is still winning. And if this story has done what stories are supposed to do when they find their way into the room you are sitting in tonight, if it has, quietly, put a small piece of a woman named Hannah, and a small piece of a woman named Fatu, and a small piece of a woman whose name we do not know, because she died in a village called Bisora in 1820 without anyone writing her name down, into the room with you, and made you understand something you did not understand an hour ago about who fed you the food you have eaten in a certain part of this country, then let me ask you one small thing before we part tonight. I have been sitting in the dark with these women for the last many months, reading the real, documented history of the enslaved cooks of the American South, the women who carried seeds across the ocean in their hair, the kitchens that fed governors while the cooks themselves were bought and sold, and turning that history into stories like this one, so that the kind of women whose names were never written down can finally be seen and heard and spoken of, out loud, in rooms like the one you are sitting in tonight. It is slow work. It is quiet work. It is the work of a small channel that lives at this moment only because of the people who watch these videos, and, occasionally, send a super thanks or a small donation to keep the research going and the microphones on and the next name lit. If Hannah moved you tonight, if the pot and the seeds and the small leaf dropped into the gumbo on the evening of the news of Elias's death sat down inside you and refused to get up, then send a super thanks below. It is the small button under the video that says thanks. Any amount, $1, $5, $20, goes directly into the next story, the next week of research, the next name I am going to bring back out of the dark. There are so many more Hannahs. There are so many more Fatus, and every one of them is waiting for someone to say her name out loud, one more time, on a channel run by a small, careful person who cares about them. That person is me. And the super thanks button is how you tell me to keep going. Say her name once more before you go. Hannah. Say her mother's name too, Fatu. And say, if you can bear the weight of it, the name of the woman we do not know, the mother of Fatu, the grandmother who braided 6 small dark seeds into her 17-year-old daughter's hair on the morning of the 4th of March, 1820, and made sure, without knowing she was doing it, that a plant of the interior of Senegambia would grow 205 years later in a garden in the 7th Ward of New Orleans, in a country she never saw and could not have imagined. Say her, too, even without her name, because she is in the pot. Then share this video with someone you love, because someone you love has, in the last year, eaten a bowl of gumbo somewhere in this country and did not know they were eating a piece of a story like this one. Someone you love needs to hear that the food they think of as American Southern was carried here in the hair of 17-year-old girls who lost everyone they loved on a march to the coast, and that the taste they have been chasing in every Creole restaurant they have ever visited is the taste of women who refused, on the morning the raiders came, to walk to the ship without a piece of their own mothers in their braids. And if you want to keep walking with me through these forgotten corners of history, the seeds hidden in the hair, the leaves dropped into the pot on the evening of terrible news, the small yellow houses in the 7th Ward where a plant is still growing that walked here from Africa in 1820, then stay a while. Subscribe. Turn on the bell. There are so many more names waiting in the dark. We are not done speaking them.